Bonus 3. This bonus video is going to describe the most important, probably, panel, basic, regarding it and its sliders. Now, in the last video, I let you know that if I open an image in Adobe Camera Raw and I make some changes and I just want to start again from scratch with that particular setup, right? I made a change. I go, I don't know if I like this change. That I could hold the Alt or the Option key. Option on the Mac, Alt on the PC, and hit Cancel at the bottom. And Cancel with the Alt or Option key down becomes Reset. The Option or Alt key has a job. All right, you're going to see today on this bonus video that it has a couple of jobs, and it can get confusing. Hey, it's a tough economy. It's a tough industry. I've got to work multiple jobs, says the Option or the Alt key. One is Option Cancel for Reset, but you'll see there's one here also for the sliders. Hey, but before I show you that, let me show you some very interesting information regarding Adobe Camera Raw, as it can edit RAW files and or JPEG. So here I'm opening. Let me cancel. Let me show you. I'm going to cancel Get Out and show you that before I opened my image in Camera Raw, I selected more than one image. For the first time, you've seen me select more than one image. Click, Shift click, or on the Mac, Shift Command click, or on the PC, Shift Control click. More than one image is selected when I went up to do Edit in Camera Raw. And for the first time then, I see along the sidebar or bottom, depending upon your orientation, you're going to see what we call the thumbnails for those images. I'm editing multiple images. At the bottom, first time you'll see an actual difference. If I say show my orientation horizontally, my thumbnails will appear at the bottom. I don't prefer that method because it really cuts in on the size of my portrait images. So I go back. I prefer vertical. No big deal. Your preferences really what matters. But you can see I've got a DNG, I've got a RAW file here, and I've got a JPEG. And let me tell you how these two images were taken. They were both taken with one shutter press. On my camera, for this demonstration, I set up the ability to take one photo in two formats at exactly the same moment. So I took the same photo as a JPEG, as both a JPEG and as a RAW file. And here they are. They look relatively similar. Now, when I do that normally, I often prefer the look of the JPEG. I mean, truly. A RAW file is raw. It is unprocessed. It's not pretty in any way. I get the raw data that I can then make pretty myself. The JPEG, though, has a couple of nice features applied to it. For example, if you did not choose flat for your picture profile or image setup, as we discussed in the previous bonus video, on a JPEG, those things get applied. Saturation gets applied. Vivid gets applied. Landscape gets applied. These color settings, none of those things actually affect a RAW file. And therefore, a RAW file might look a little bit worse for wear before you start the edit. It will not remain that way, however, as you will see. Look what happens on the JPEG. I'm just going to click a couple of buttons and sliders. You can count with me, work with me, and notice that while they look very similar, there is soon going to be a wide disparity in the quality of these two images. Same image, captured with one shutter click. Here we go. This file was an old file. It was edited a long time ago, the last time I edited it. So long ago, in fact, that I'm receiving a little warning down here. There's a little kind of a yield sign upside down with an exclamation point in it. It's letting me know, wow, Rick, you haven't edited this file in a long time and you'll need to update. When I hover, you'll need to update to the current process version. Update it with the current sliders. Update it with the current panels. It's out of date. So I'm going to click that button. If you ever see that button, and you won't if you're just getting started newly in Adobe Camera Raw, but if you've been doing it a while, you'll see that. If you open old files, they need to be updated. I'm going to click that button under the JPEG once. Doesn't seem like much happened. I'm going to undo, but look over at my sliders. Right here, the sliders. Exposure, recovery, fill light. Look what happens when I click that button. Exposure, contrast, highlights. Recovery and fill light are very old slider types, slider names. They've been eliminated for much better versions of sliders. When I click that button, I get the newest sliders. If you don't see that button, you already have the newest sliders. Let that sink in. All right, the second thing I'm going to do to my JPEG is say auto. I can do automatic. You decide, Mr. Computer. You saw me do that earlier by doing Command or Control U. You figure it out. But the long cut, not the shortcut, is to sneak up to the top of the panel and hit auto. I'm going to hit auto. Something automatically happened. I still don't like it, but there it is. Whatever it is, I'm trying to figure out what it is. And now I'm going to go down to the shadows area. The almost darkest images, the almost darkest tones. And I'm going to up the shadows. No love, still no love. I'm stopping. What did I do? I clicked a button to update. I clicked auto. I opened shadows. No luck. Let me tell you why. JPEGs are much smaller files than RAW files. Why? Why are they smaller? Well, they're at a smaller, what's called a smaller bit depth. There aren't as many crayons in the box. But number two, JPEGs are small because they throw away, they eliminate, they destroy your shadow crayons. Instead of getting a wide variety of dark and semi-dark and almost dark crayons, JPEGs throw them all out and give you a crayon or four to represent all the shadows. Yuck. Trick you learned last bonus video. Option or Alt, click Reset. I'm back to the way this image looked when I opened it. All right, since I have two thumbnails here, I can go to the other thumbnail, the RAW file. No big win here, right? We're going to do the same three things. You can follow along. You know where I'm going. I'm clicking the update sign. One click. I'm hitting auto. I'm dragging the shadow slider. Wow. Oh, it's a pool. It's someone's backyard. RAW files can be saved with these magic sliders. JPEGs can usually not. Hey, if I were to create a new bumper sticker for you, it might look like this. Friends don't let friends shoot JPEG. They're garbage. And you've been spending hours in Photoshop trying to rescue JPEGs. Give it up. No reason to do so. No sense in it. RAW files are larger for a good reason. Use them. They can be saved. I'm going to still look up my blackest blacks. Black slider could be opened still. Hey, I need a little contrast. I'll play with the contrast slider. Contrast is the difference between the 25% crayons, the almost whites, and the shadows, the almost darks. It doesn't touch the ends, contrast. It comes in 25% on each side and pushes them to be more different. It takes the 25% and the 75% and pushes them away from each other, creating more difference, more contrast. I'm rescuing my image. Let's hold the Alt key or the Option key and hit reset and see what a long way we've come, baby. There it is. You can see I'm right back to the old process. I'm going to click it and start over. Let's discuss the sliders. The sliders. The first couple of sliders you see are the temperature and tint sliders. Now, if you grew up when I did a long time ago, there was a television set in our living room and there were two little knobs. One was called tint and one was called temp. Now, I didn't know what they did, but my dad would bark orders off the sofa. Hey, Ricky, go over and play with those two knobs, the temperature and the tint. I know now that the temp knob dialed between blue versus yellow. That is a scientific spectrum, blue to yellow. It's represented by the word temp or temperature, blue to yellowness. The tint is represented by green to magenta-ness. Magenta. That's the big grown-up artsy word for kind of middle pinkish. So temperature is blue to yellow. Tint is green to magenta. If I need my sky so on to be a little bit more blue, I can suck out the yellowness. If it's too pink, I can add a little greenness. That's how those sliders work. That's how those sliders work. All right. It thinks now I have changed my white balance. Because when you play with those sliders, and you notice this dark line here, those all belong together. The temp and the tint are white balance features. I have now customized it. I could pop up on that and say, no, reset it to the way I shot it. It's back to the way it was. It's like a reset for white balance. Let's continue. We've talked about exposure, highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks represented by the histogram. I told you that contrast, while not represented on the histogram, still is a useful slider. I'm going to show you how these sliders ought to be arranged, in my humble opinion. Highlights and whites ought to be together. They ought to be right next to each other. Highlights and whites. Why do I say that? Because remember, the whites are on the far right side, and right next to those are the highlights. I believe highlights and whites should be sliders that are right next to each other. They are not, but I want you to know that instead, either way, they go together. Highlights belong with whites, as shadows belong with blacks. They're the opposite sides of your histogram, of your tonal range, where exposure is in the center. Now, the reason Adobe separated those, most probably to give them the benefit of the doubt, is that typically in Photoshop, listen, in Photoshop, when you edit the shadows, let me play here. I just did Auto, Command U, you figure it out as a starting point. But when you play with the shadows in Photoshop, the blacks go brighter also. Shadows and blacks are the same thing in Photoshop. Highlights and whites are the same thing in Photoshop. But interestingly, in Adobe Camera Raw, while I can open my shadows, I can go in the opposite direction with my blacks. While I can brighten my whites, I can dial down my highlights. It's actually quite remarkable if you think about it. Without any selections, without any major work, as I might have to do in Photoshop, I can tell my brightest brights to go one way and my almost brights to be another. My shadows can open up, but I can keep, hear me, the contrast that I receive and achieve with my blackest blacks. So very often what we want to do is to set my shadows open, but not my blacks. Open up the shadows. Watch this. I'm going to give you another shortcut. If I hold the Shift key, Mac or PC, and double click the slider, it will do auto on just that slider. Maybe I don't want to do auto everything, which is what Command U did, or at the top, auto. I just want to auto one thing. So I'm going to hold the Shift key, and you'll notice that when the Shift key is down, these words by the sliders seem to change here or there. They change for exposure. Now it says auto exposure, auto contrast, auto highlights, auto shadows, auto whites. Texture, clarity, and dehaze didn't change at all. But auto vibrance, auto saturation. Not everything, but most everything. I'm holding the Shift key, and I double click the little handle on the slider. Shift, double click, and it auto reset just the blacks. To what? To perfection. It set my blacks to perfection for printing without going so dark it can't be held. It would plug up otherwise. If I changed my exposure manually, then I Shift, double click the highlights nubbin, it says you need to fix your highlights. Shift, double click the whites. You need to fix your whites. You could even Shift, double click exposure. Now I just auto with my Shift key 4 different sliders. I might as well, if that were the case, maybe just hit the big auto button. You see, but it's a difference. I can pick and choose which slider gets automatically corrected. My shadows are up manually. I'm going to Shift, double click, auto, just the blacks. It spares you from having to look at your image on a calibrated or not calibrated monitor. It plays perfection by the numbers, just like you were a pilot flying a plane. You're not flying by looking through your windshield. No, you're flying by the instrument panel. New trick then, Shift, double click the slider nubbin for auto. I told you earlier though, the Option key is working many jobs. It's time to see his second job. When you hold the Option key, notice that it's not the sliders that change, but the panel names. Reset, basic. Reset, curves. It'll reset the entire panel of sliders. It resets if I do auto and I hold the Option key and click the title of that panel. Basic, it becomes reset every slider in that panel. Now, why are these off? Why aren't these centered? Because that's the way it was shot, the white balance. It has, in fact, reset everything for me. So Option has another job worth knowing. Option has a third job. If you hold the Option key and click on one slider's handle, it shows you starkly where the brightest highlights are. I can drag and see that I'm affecting them in some way. It just gives you a big reveal. Where are the brightest brights? Now, my far end are whites. If I hold the Option key and click on the white slider, it goes, these areas right here are your brightest white crayons. Well, I might want to rescue those from being too bright. I'll pull those down. Starkly, with the Option key down, I can see that I don't have any super brights anymore. I let go of everything, and apparently my image is okay. I just pulled my brightest brights back into print grace. How do you know if you're printing well or not? How do you know if it's going to print well or not? the histogram has two little buddies. I'm almost done with you. The histogram has two little buddies. One here at the top left, one on the top right. It looks almost like a little black chocolate kiss, a little pink chocolate kiss. Pink kiss, is that chocolate? I don't know. I wouldn't eat it. And you've got a shortcut. You can click those buttons, but you've got two shortcuts to turn on those buttons without clicking. O for overexpose and U for underexpose. And when you look at an image, Auto, if there are overexposed areas, they'll alert, like the red chocolate kiss is showing me here, they will alert in a really ugly red. If you have areas that are so dark that they're going to plug up at print time, they're underexposed. They'll show up in blue, stark blue. That was O for overexposed alert and U for underexposed alert. And if you leave those on, you can't explain to somebody looking over your shoulder what those things are. I just do it in private while I'm working. But with those on, I can rescue the brightest brights or the highlights. I'm dialing that down, highlights, until I rescue those blown out highlights. Highlights didn't do it, so now I have to go to whites. Remember, they're related. Oh, I just rescued, for high-end printability, that sky. Wow. Okay, I want my shadows opened up. That did some rescuing of my underexposed areas. Now I'll hold my blacks with the alert on, and I've rescued even the underexposed areas. And if those two alerts are still on, they are, I just don't see any errors, and I play with my contrast, you may see that while you're playing with your sliders, you could redevelop issues. So it may behoove you to work with those alerts on so that you can make fixes or changes along the way. It's hard to explain when a customer's looking over your shoulder, as I've said, but it helps you to get the very best high quality print. It even looks great on your screen, but I'm telling you, it'll print. I've had customers tell me that's the most important trick they've ever learned in my Adobe Camera Raw teaching. Their prints are improved from that single tip. New shortcut. Just the letter P. P is preview, before and after. Now, it doesn't do a very good job of previewing before and after, because look how much was plugged up to begin with. So I'm going to hit O and U again, O and U, and I turned off the overexposure and the underexposure alerts as I hit P for preview. And that's the way the image looked when we opened it without having to reset. P is preview, 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 P, P, P. That's a good start for the sliders. I've described to you the sliders that we start with first under the basic panel. Basic. Temp and tint, they're white balance fixers, exposure, contrast, and so on. What I haven't shown you, and we'll get to it, texture, clarity, dehaze. Pretend that they mean enhance details, and make my skies more blue. Enhance details, texture. If there's texture, you can enhance the detail. Look at my trees. Clarity is also a detail enhancer, but it only enhances details in the middle tones of my histogram. Clarity updates, previews, fixes detail in my midtones. At least that's what the manual says. I found, however, that it sometimes takes a hit with my shadows. So generally, when I play with my clarity, I usually need to, and I'm going to reset this, play with my shadows as well. I'm going to just watch my clarity. Clarity up. Clarity up. But it plugs up my shadows very often, so I'll often, when I use clarity, up my shadow detail as well. P. My colors look relatively wimpy. That's vibrance and saturation. Those are color pumpers. They're very similar to each other, with one tiny exception, and I'll tell you what that is in a moment. Saturation says take whatever color's in there and pump it, baby. Andy Warhol, vivid, pump it. But vibrance says do it, but do everything except the flesh tones. Pump every color before you pump flesh tones. That lets you get greener greens and bluer skies, but it doesn't affect the people in your photos. They won't look fake. The greens will look pumped. The blues will look pumped. That's an old Fujifilm trick, basically. Pump the blues and the greens, but don't pump the flesh tones. That's what vibrance does. Now, it will pump the flesh tones, but only when you get to the very end of that range. Now, in this image, what I have that are of flesh tones is sort of that pink cloud sky. But notice when I pumped it with saturation, oof, that hurt. Even the clouds went crazy on me. But when I pump with vibrance, they're the last things to pump. That's the difference. All right, that's it. Basic panel sliders. Bonus video 3. I'll see you for bonus video 4. I wonder what we're going to talk about. It looks to me like we're going to talk about importing and exporting from Bridge and or Adobe Camera Raw. See you in the next bonus video.